Good day, philosophers. Here we're going to have yet another video where we're looking at Kant and Aristotle and contrasting them in particular on the nature of universal law, right? So in the last video, we saw some big differences between Kant and Aristotle, in particular and fundamental that we always got to be thinking here, we got to be thinking about the concept of virtue. And we saw in Aristotle in the concept of virtue that a virtuous person fundamentally has the right kind of understanding, the right character, and the right skill to be able to do a beautiful, excellent actions, right? And to do them reliably over the course of their lives. They take great pleasure and ease in doing the right actions. For Kant, though, when Kant is thinking about um, morality, Kant seemed to say that, with regard to character in particular, that the best, most moral person doesn't have the sort of unity between their reason and their desires that comes together in the character of a virtuous person. There's always a schism. There's always tension between our inclinations, or which are always directing us towards fulfilling our desires and all that, like food, drink, sex, all that kind of stuff. And then our reason, which is demanding that we fulfill the moral law. There was constant tension between those, and those never come together. At best, Kant says that in terms of the character of a person, at best, all you have is contents. For Aristotle, we have this idea that virtue is possible, at least in terms of character. We're now also going to particularly look at the understanding of the virtuous person for Aristotle, and how the relationship between universals and particulars when it comes to knowledge and human action differs from how Kant thinks of the universal quite a little bit. And this is going to be really important because, remember, for Kant, fulfilling the moral law is the fundamental meaning of having a good will, and only a good will is good in and of itself, right? So for Kant, the only way to be good is to have a good will. And that means to act out of duty and respect of the moral law, understanding the moral law and doing it. For Aristotle, there's much more subtlety to it in many ways. But what does it mean to follow a universal law for Kant versus Aristotle? Well, let's start with Aristotle. And in Aristotle, Aristotle has this interesting concept when it comes to universals, and this concept of decency. Depending on your translation, it's also sometimes called equity, right? And decency and equity fundamentally takes a look at that. It's saying that there's sometimes a problem with laws being universal. There can be an issue with laws being universal. Sometimes when a law is universal, it doesn't seem to connect to the truth. For instance, you might say, is it true that you should always stop at a stop sign? I would argue, sure, yes. Can you imagine a situation, though, where it would not be right to stop at a stop sign, right? Let's say, you have someone in your car and it's late at night and they're hurt and you're trying to get them to the hospital, or in something like that, and you get to a stop sign. You sort of come to you don't quite stop, but you slow down enough to look and make sure that there's no one there, and then you blow right through it, right? Is that the right thing? Or is it similar to all traffic laws? We could probably find lots of reasons why it would be right to violate traffic laws. And the idea here is that Aristotle will say that it's perfectly fine and it's not only perfectly fine, sometimes it's necessary to violate universal laws. Now, this sounds kind of crazy, right? But it's necessary to violate universal laws as an act of decency or equity. In other words, there's sometimes that the universal law doesn't actually communicate what the right action is. So let's just take a quick look at Aristotle's Ethics. Do I have this open here somewhere? Let's see here. Boom, boom, boom. Here we go. So in Aristotle's Ethics, Book 5, Chapter 10. Oops, let me close this. I have too many windows open. Sometimes I like just using physical books, but I'm trying to do this digitally, so we'll see how this works. But Aristotle, Book 5, Chapter 10, talks about equity or decency. This is a slightly different translation than the one we've assigned, so the words will be a little bit different, but that's cool, right? Here Aristotle talks about universal law, and he says the reason that all law is Aristotle, says that sometimes there's issues with universal law. And he says, the reason is that all law is universal, and there are some things about which one cannot speak correctly in universal terms, right? That there are situations that the universality of the way that we communicate laws doesn't necessarily communicate the truth, right? And so instead, what we see is that law takes into account what happens more often, right? So for Aristotle, he would say that the fact that we have certain laws are trying to communicate that that's what you should do in virtually every instance, right? For instance, for Aristotle, should you tell the exact truth to someone? It would seem like for Aristotle, in almost every instance, you should speak the exact truth to people. Can you imagine a situation where you shouldn't speak the exact truth? Well, what if there was a situation where speaking the exact truth was extraordinarily harmful to another person, right? So the virtuous person might find a way of speaking the truth in a kind of way that still communicates what's essential, but not necessarily communicating the hurtful thing, right? That so if my if someone asks you, you know, do I look good in this outfit? Right? You could find just the right way of communicating the truth that maybe they don't look good in it, but in a kind way, so that it's not just about just plainly speaking your mind exactly the way it is. Now, maybe Kant will be okay with that as well too. But also, we could also bring up Nazis. It's a fun thing to do in statistics. You're like, what would you do if a Nazi came to your house and was asking you if you had a Jewish woman hidden there or something like that? Would you tell the truth to a Nazi? That's a fundamental thing. So for Aristotle, he would say even if it is a moral law that you should always speak the truth, there are some certain situations where just following the law is not going to be adequate. So Aristotle, he would say, for the error is attributable not to the law nor to the lawgiver, but to the nature of the case, since the subject matter of action is like this in its essence. And so here's the kind of idea. When he's saying that it's about the case, it's about the complicated nature of the world, right? When Aristotle thinks about decency and equity, he's fundamentally saying that the world, right, is complicated. It's very, very complicated. That in particular, when we encounter other humans do wrong. Other humans do wrong. And sometimes the sort of the broken nature of the world itself, or the complicated nature of the world itself, and the kinds of evils that other people will choose to do might change things that we wouldn't typically do into something that we might do in this particular instance. This is actually in many ways connected to what Aristotle called mixed actions. You guys remember mixed actions was when there was something that you wouldn't typically do, but all of a sudden you'd find yourself being willing to do just in this particular set of circumstances because of the nature of the crazy situation itself. And so Aristotle has this concept of decency, right? Let's go back to the text and just see a little bit more, right? When Aristotle talks about this, he's fundamentally saying that that in these particular situations, that the decent thing to do is really what the lawgiver would have even done if they had known about this situation. He says this would be this will excuse me this will be by saying that what the lawgiver would himself have said had he been present and would have included within the law had he known. If a lawgiver could have understood this particular circumstance well enough, they would have included it in the law. But it gets way too complicated to have every single particular way of doing things included in the law. That's one of the reasons why we need lawyers today, because the law tries to account for every single circumstance, right? And so really for Aristotle, there is such thing as a correction of the law when there's some deficiency because of the universality of the law. And Aristotle even say that there's some things that you don't necessarily write laws about. You trust someone of good judgment. And so that's the idea here. For Aristotle, more important than good laws, right? More important than good laws is fundamentally having good judgment, right? And that's what decency is. It's a concept that cuts across into virtue uh, as well as thinking about laws in terms of um, legal laws and things like that, right? That fundamentally, whether we're talking about individuals or we're talking about society as a whole, the most important thing for us is to exercise excellent good judgment, right? That a universal law won't ever be able to be perfectly applied to any instance, right? If all we needed were laws, then all we would have is a legislature in the United States. But we don't have just a legislature. We have people who have to carry out the laws and apply them to the particular circumstances. And so we need to have a judge who looks at a particular case and says, how does the law fit with this, right? Similarly, within our own lives, when we look at the complicated nature of our particular lives, we need to have good judgment. That's part of what the virtuous person is. The virtuous person doesn't just have these universal principles of right and wrong. They are people who are able to correctly see how that universal applies to these particulars. And that's what Aristotle is really ultimately fundamentally talking about. The understanding of the virtuous person is that having this person of good judgment. Now, if we contrast that with Kant, Kant as a much more strict line on the idea of universal law, right? When Kant looks at, I'm going to erase a bunch of this stuff here. When Kant looks at universal law, he's fundamentally going to be thinking about it in terms of the dictates of reason about what's right and what's wrong. Now, here's one of these things. Remember how we said in a previous class, for Kant was all about the intentions. And again, it seems like if you have a good intention, you're doing the right action. So, like, if you intend to help someone, then all that matters is that you intended to help someone. But for Kant, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because your intention needs to be to fulfill the moral law, fulfill the moral law. And so the moral law fundamentally has the primary place when we're thinking about what's right and what's wrong, right? And we can't sit there and play loosey-goosey about what's actually demanded by the moral law. We have this fundamental duty to act according to duty, to act to fulfill the moral law itself. So when Kant thinks about moral laws, he thinks about them in a very strict sense, right? Let's take a quick look at Kant here. So, oops, let's pull this up. When Kant, here in the Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals, if we look at our page around 14 here, Kant, when he talks about universal laws, he says, I should never act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law. So this is actually connected to one of the ways that Kant says we can actually discover what are our moral laws. It's connected to something called the categorical imperative. And we're not really here to talk about the categorical imperative in and of itself and what the different versions of the categorical imperative, that's an imperative, right? But Kant says that one of the ways that we know what the moral law is that the moral law is by nature universal. That anything that we can will as a true universal law is going to be a sort of moral law for all people to follow. And all moral laws have to be maintained as universal. Kant might wonder about the example of lying. I sort of mentioned lying before, lying to a friend, lying to a Nazi, right? And for Kant, could you lie? Well, for Kant, to say that you could lie would mean that you would say, I'm going to make lying a universal moral law for all people. Can I make lying a universal moral law for all people? Well, Kant reflects on this. He says, what would that mean? He says, then I immediately become aware that I can indeed will that the lie, but I can indeed will the lie, but cannot at all will a universal law to lie. Can I read that one more time? One more time. Then I immediately become aware that I can indeed will the lie, but I cannot at all will a universal law to lie. Because here's the idea. If I want to lie, the only purpose of me lying is that if I'm the only liar, right? When I lie, I want to be able to lie myself, but I don't want other people to lie. I don't want to make it a universal law that all people should always not tell the truth, right? And so for Kant, the very fact that there is a law to tell the truth means you must always tell the truth. It doesn't matter in that sense what my intention was, right? If I'm just trying to say that I intend a good outcome, right? The intention of a good outcome is never a moral intention for Kant. That's ultimately saying me intending a good outcome for Kant is me saying that I want to fulfill my inclinations. And just like we saw in the other video, that fulfilling your inclinations is never a moral end. The ultimate moral end is only to fulfill the moral law. So if I just want good outcome, so if I say, can I lie to my friend about whether they look nice today? And someone says, yes, you can lie to them, then what you're really saying is that I don't care about the moral law, I just want to have a good outcome. And the fulfillment of good outcomes is never going to be the moral end, right? For Kant, he would say that you shouldn't ultimately care about what the outcome is. The only thing you should care about is that you're fundamentally doing the right thing, right? Even to a Nazi, should you lie to a Nazi? For Kant, answer, no. Why? Because it doesn't matter what the outcome is of your action. It only matters is that you were willing to fulfill the moral law. Now, let me try to defend Kant just a little bit here too as well, because you might say, well, he's just, how could he be so insensitive? How could he care so little, right? But what Kant would ultimately say is that, again, the consequences of our actions are not entirely up to us. Morality is not about consequences. If you think about your friend, if you were to lie to your friend about whether or not they look nice, or you weren't to really clearly communicate the truth of the situation, then you might find that your friend goes out and looks terrible in a situation and ends up feeling worse about themselves than if you had just simply told the truth from the beginning. Similarly with a Nazi, right? What's going to happen if you tell a lie to a Nazi? You don't necessarily know what's going to happen if you tell the truth or if you tell a lie. If you tell a lie, you might find that that lie leads to worse consequences than you simply telling the truth, right? You aren't fully in charge of those consequences. The only thing that you do have control over is yourself, right? You might find that in telling the truth to the Nazi, it might even be a more effective way in the Nazi not believing you. I don't know. A Nazi's gonna be like, someone wouldn't actually tell me the truth about whether there was a Jew, and if you said that there is, I'm not going to believe you. I don't know. I'm being kind of preposterous here. But again, since the consequences are not entirely up to us for Kant, the most fundamental thing is that you seek to fulfill that moral law, and that's what you should be after, right? Laws are universal for Kant, and him saying you must act according to the right intention is not a free pass so that any intention you have is perfectly acceptable as an intention. There is no free pass when it comes to intentions. All intentions must be an intention to fulfill the moral law. And so any kind of situation where you try to make yourself the only counterexample to universal law so that everyone else has to tell the truth except for me, everyone else has to respect other people's property except for me, everyone else has to respect their I don't know, respect their marital bonds except for me and stuff like that. None of that applies for Kant. There is no intention that gets you off the hook if the intention is something other than fulfilling the moral law. I hope this helps a little bit. Have a beautiful day, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Oh, let me